call came in on a Tuesday. Her voice was a whisper, so soft I had to press the phone tight against my ear. "Mr. Vance, is that you? Sir, you have to see this, and please, don't tell your daughter yet." I felt the ground tremble beneath me. Just one day later, I would uncover the truth he'd hidden from all of us, a truth that shattered everything I thought I knew. Before we move on, I just want to say thank you. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this voice travels. My name is Kalen Vance. I'm 62 years old, the kind of age when people like to say you've seen enough of life not to be surprised by much anymore. But life has its own way of reminding you that you're never really experienced enough. My days revolved around the familiar, the morning coffee brewed in a pot with a tiny crack down the side, the creak of the oak step on the porch when I leaned my weight on it, and the sunlight that always rose from the same spot behind Miller's Ridge. Our little town of Oak Haven was small enough that a 10-minute drive could take you past the city limits, but quiet enough that you could hear the crickets singing every summer night. And of course, there was the Sunday phone call from my daughter, Alara. She was my whole world. After her mother passed when she was only 15, I tried to be both father and mother. I often thought raising her was like building the longest bridge of my life. Every beam, every bolt had to be placed right, firm, and strong, so it would never collapse when she needed to cross through her hardest years. Alara grew into a woman brighter than I could have ever imagined. The kind of brightness you don't see with your eyes, but with how she could fill a silent house with the pulse of life. She was kind, sharp, and saw farther than most her age. But life rarely lets souls like that rest in peace. Then Julian Croft appeared, and everything changed color. He was nothing like me. Polished, the kind of polished you see in men who wear tailored suits, whose shoes are so soft you never hear them coming. He spoke smoothly, the kind of man who knew his own charm, knew exactly when to smile, when to raise an eyebrow, just enough to make you feel like you were talking to someone important. He founded a company called Etherian Dynamics, supposedly raising funds for a revolutionary solar energy technology. Words like new era, transformative, reshaping the future, poured from his mouth like water from a spring. To me, those words felt exhausting. All I could see were load-bearing diagrams, budget sheets, the kind I'd spent 30 years reviewing as an auditor for the Department of Transportation. But Alara looked at him the way someone looks at a rising star, bright, beautiful, and full of promise. I didn't blame her. She lost her mother too young. She deserved someone who could make her laugh again. And when I heard her laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years, it loosened something inside me, like an old rope finally being untied after years of strain. So even though I sensed something off in the way Julian looked at me, the quiet arrogance of a man who believes he's above others, I stayed silent. Because for a father, his daughter's happiness can blur a lot of things. Sometimes, it blurs them so much that you don't notice the first faint signals of a revenge story forming quietly behind your back. But life doesn't stay silent for long. That Tuesday afternoon, that whispered phone call, was the exact moment when everything shifted, and there was no turning back. The engagement party took place at the end of May, exactly 6 months ago. The day was beautiful in a way that softened the heart. The sun just right, the breeze just enough, and the vineyard where they hosted it looked spotless, as if meticulously polished before opening. I remember driving my old pickup truck there, about 30 minutes from home, just enough time to rehearse the small talk people used at fancy events like this. Honestly, I was never good at blending into those worlds. The kind where people spoke only of investments, shares, markets, things I read about for knowledge, but never truly lived among. I wore my best suit, not expensive, bought over 10 years ago for a friend's wedding, but I always hung it carefully in the closet, with a piece of cedar at the back to maintain its scent. Putting it on made me feel like a dusted-off antique, slightly out of place among a forest of dark suits and polished leather shoes. But it was my daughter's ceremony. As long as she was happy, I could stand in a room full of strangers with wallets 100 times fatter than mine, and I would endure it. Julian, on the other hand, was different. He stood in the crowd of wealthy friends like a peacock fanning its tail. Sunlight glinted off the expensive watch on his wrist, the kind I guessed was worth several months of a construction worker's salary. He saw me approaching and immediately flashed a smile wide enough to look rehearsed in a mirror. "Kalen, so good to see you," he said, clapping me firmly on the shoulder. "We need to get you out of Oakhaven more often, let you see what the 21st century looks like." The words sounded light as air, yet they carried a subtle sting to the pride. I'm not a sensitive man, but the way he spoke, smiling while sizing me up, made me realize I was being placed into a box labeled stubborn old man from a small town. He smiled, but his eyes did not. It wasn't a greeting smile. It was the kind of smile a person gives when examining old furniture, trying to decide if it's worth keeping or should be put in storage. I tried to ignore it. I'm an adult. I don't need anyone's approval. But then I overheard him talking to an investor, and it was the tone that froze me. Her father, huh? The classic salt-of-the-earth type. Former civil servant, a solid, dependable guy, but a little analog. Analog. Just one word, but it made my heart jump slightly. I didn't need an explanation. That was the polite way of saying I was outdated, behind the times, not keeping up with the world. I'd heard that judgment many times in my life, but never, not once, in the middle of my daughter's engagement party. Alara was standing nearby. She heard everything. I saw her straighten, like an arrow released from a bow. "You're the smartest person I know, Dad," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You've built half the bridges in this state." My throat tightened. Pride, gratitude, and a twinge of sadness that she had to speak up to defend me before the man she was about to call husband. Julian just smiled, that slick, oily machine kind of smile. "Of course, darling. The foundation is what matters." On the surface, it sounded like praise, but in reality, it was a cut. He spoke as if people like me only knew how to dig holes and mix cement. The bigger things, like changing the world, were the work of men like him. At that moment, I felt a different atmosphere. Subtle, but unmistakable. As if the whole meticulously arranged party had just released a faint pine smoke, the first hint of a hidden fire. There was something off about this man. A thin veil of deceit lurking behind his perfectly pressed suit. The party went on. Glasses clinked, voices chattered, soft music played from hidden speakers among the vineyard. But in my head, the word analog hovered like a fine crack in concrete. Not dangerous yet, but enough to warn that beneath the surface, something unstable was forming. Driving home that night, the road from the vineyard to the highway stretched about 12 miles, just enough for my thoughts to loop endlessly. The old truck rattled over potholes, a familiar sound that brought me comfort amidst the tangle of emotions. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the yellow lights of the vineyard fade behind me. It felt like watching a life I didn't belong to. Not because I was inferior, but because somewhere inside, I knew I was standing at the very first step of a betrayal far larger than the insults at the party. A crack had appeared. And though I couldn't yet see its full extent, I knew it would not stop there. The call came, exactly 6 months after the engagement party, as if someone somewhere had planned it all along. That Thursday afternoon was quiet. I was sitting on the porch, a cup of black coffee gone cold beside me, the sun just dipping behind the line of trees along the dirt road. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. Area code from a city about 40 miles away from Oakhaven. I let it ring a few times, wondering if I should even pick up, but something in my gut told me I had to. "Mr. Vance?" The voice was small and trembling, like the girl had to cup her hand over her mouth so no one else could hear. "Yes," I answered. "Who's calling?" There was a thin silence, no more than 2 seconds, but enough to raise every hair on the back of my neck. "It's Maya, Mr. Croft's assistant." "Sir, you need to see this, and please don't tell your daughter yet." My heart didn't just sink. It stopped, a kind of stillness that made the hum of cicadas outside sound painfully loud. I rose from my chair, gripping the weathered oak railing that had faded through countless winters. The evening wind carried that familiar damp scent of soil, the smell I'd always tied to peace. Yet now it felt different, warning, as if the air itself knew a storm was coming. "Maya, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though inside I felt like the backyard during a thunderstorm, scattered, raw, and full of noise. "I can't say over the phone," she whispered. "Please, meet me, halfway between your town and the city, somewhere public, tomorrow morning." I pressed her for details, but she only repeated one thing: "You deserve to know the truth." Then the line went dead, soft and sudden, like a thread snapping in my hand. I stood there for a long while, watching the last light of the day cling to the road like a thin streak of gold. Some moments you just know, from the very second they arrive, that your life will never be the same again. That call was one of them. This wasn't just another family drama, the kind that happens when a child falls in love with the wrong person. No, this was something deeper, darker, like a curtain being ripped away from my eyes. That night, I barely slept. I kept pacing the kitchen, the soft yellow glow from the lamp stretching the shadows across the old walls. I made myself a cup of hot tea, the kind I usually drink when I have too many thoughts swirling around, but couldn't finish even 2 sips. I remember every sound, the wind scraping across the roof, the clock on the wall ticking, slow and deliberate, as if mocking the wait. The next morning, I drove to the meeting place, a roadside diner locals often stop by on long drives. The sign above the door was red, sun-faded, hanging a little crooked, the kind of place where the food isn't great, but always comes hot and cheap. As I pushed the door open, the little bell chimed softly, and a rush of burnt coffee and cheap pancake syrup filled the air. Maya was already there. A young woman, much smaller than I remembered, maybe in her early 20s. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that comes from too many sleepless nights. In front of her sat a glass of water she hadn't touched. Condensation ran slowly down the side. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and pulled out a chair. "Tell me, what's going on?" She reached into her bag, her hands trembling slightly, and placed a small silver USB drive on the table. So small I could have slipped it into my pocket unnoticed. But her eyes, the way she looked at that little thing like it was a loaded gun, told me it was anything but ordinary. "He thinks everyone's an idiot," she said, voice catching. "But I know he can't fool you. You were kind to me once. I haven't forgotten." I frowned. "Kind? What do you mean?" Then it hit me. A memory, ordinary, almost forgettable. The engagement party. A dusty parking lot. A sedan with a flat tire. A nervous young girl fumbling for the jack. And me, the only one who noticed, stopping to help simply because it felt like the right thing to do. It hadn't taken more than 10 minutes. A small act, so small it shouldn't have meant anything. But to Maya, it was enough. Enough to pull her into the center of the storm. Enough to make her choose the right side, even if it cost her a steady job and the comfort of an easy life in the city. She finally looked me in the eye, for the first time since I'd arrived. "In this USB," she said, "is everything you need to see. Numbers, documents, recordings, all his. Mr. Croft isn't who you think he is, and he isn't who your daughter thinks he is either." A chill ran down my spine, sharp and cold, as if someone had opened the back door and let the winter wind pour straight into the diner. I set my hand on the USB, felt the metal's cold edge against my palm. It felt like touching the beginning of a revenge story, one I hadn't yet realized I was the main character of. Maya's hands were clenched tight now, trying to stop them from shaking. "Mr. Vance," she said quietly, "if you don't watch it, a lot of people will get hurt, and you're the only one who can stop it." For several seconds, I couldn't say a word. I just looked at her, at those small but steady shoulders, at the fear and resolve pulling at the corners of her eyes. A young woman. A USB drive. A truth I didn't yet know, but one that would change everything. I slipped the USB into my jacket pocket. "Thank you, Maya," I said softly. "Leave it to me." And in that very moment, I knew. My life was about to turn down a road with no way back. That night, when I got home, darkness had fully fallen. The whole street was empty, with only the yellow porch light spilling onto the worn oak step in front of my house. I hung my coat, shut the door, and for a few seconds, the whole house fell so silent I could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner of the kitchen. The small silver USB lay snug in my jacket pocket, as light as nothing. Yet during the more than 30-mile drive back to Oak Haven, it felt as heavy as a stone. Every time my hand brushed the pocket involuntarily, my heart tightened. I made a cup of black coffee, the cheap supermarket kind on sale, just enough to keep me awake, not to enjoy. Then I went straight to the workshop behind the house, the place I half-jokingly call my headquarters. The room was small, wooden walls, an old desk, a desktop computer more than 10 years old, a ceiling fan that squeaked whenever it turned. I sat down, placed the USB on the desk, right on top of the long scratch I once made when I pulled a steel ruler down too hard. For a long time, I didn't plug it in. I just looked at it, as if I were staring at something that was breathing, something that, the moment you touch it, would change everything irreversibly. Maya's voice at the roadside diner replayed in my head, every word clear. "He thinks everyone is an idiot, Mr. Vance. He brags about it." I remembered the burnt coffee smell in the diner, the damp rain scent clinging to the jackets of the truckers at the next table, the clink of cutlery, the low hum of the air conditioning. Among those ordinary sounds, her words hit like a gunshot. Ethereum Dynamics, it's just a shadow. That technology is fake. This is a Ponzi scheme. He's been targeting community investment funds, little towns with big hopes. I had read about schemes like this in the financial paper people left at the breakfast joint. Articles I thought I skimmed merely to stay informed, never imagining they would touch my life. And yet here, now the words Ponzi scheme sat at the center of my daughter's story, at the center of our small house in Oak Haven. Maya did not stop there. His final fundraising round, it's aimed at the Oak Haven Municipal Retirement Fund. Your friends, your neighbors. He's planning a town meeting next month to close the books. He's using your daughter's engagement as proof of his commitment to the community. I remember sitting in stunned silence for a few seconds. The faces of familiar people flashed through my mind. Hank at the post office, the Reeds who run the corner store, the hairdresser who always asks about Alara when she comes home. Each of them had been putting aside pennies into their retirement fund, believing they were investing in a green future. And that slick future son-in-law, the man lifting a wine glass in the vineyard and clapping me on the shoulder like an old friend, was preparing to turn those hopes into cash in his pocket. In the workshop, I let out a long breath, as if someone had pulled aside a curtain to reveal the thick stench of deceit I'd been pretending not to smell, not because I was foolish, because Alara was smiling. And what father would want to question the thing that makes his child smile like sunshine? I remember Maya's look, those young eyes full of fear, but also resolute. "Mr. Vance, if you don't act, people will lose everything, not just money, trust, the whole town." Those words chased me all the way back, and now, within 4 wooden walls, they reverberated as if she were standing right behind me. I picked up the USB, rolling it between my fingers. One light click, a few file drags, and I'd see what Maya risked everything to steal. What Julian would not hesitate to crush if he ever found out it had slipped from his hands. I inserted the USB into the port on the case. A soft click sounded. The screen flickered for a few seconds before an icon for a new drive appeared. My hand rested on the mouse, but I didn't open it immediately. My mind drifted back to a Sunday when Alara sat on the porch telling me about Julian with eyes bright. "Dad, he isn't like ordinary men. He thinks big. He wants to change the world." I used to smile and nod, even when I didn't know exactly what changing the world meant. Now, sitting here, I understood. For men like Julian, changing the world can be a beautiful excuse to hide a long string of betrayals, to stab those who trust them the most, then gather the money and run. I sipped the now cold coffee, grimacing at the bitterness, but it kept me awake. My fingers double-clicked the first folder. Files populated the screen: financial reports, contracts, backup emails, sprawling spreadsheets full of numbers, fund names, small-town names from various states, 6- and 7-figure sums, all mixed, but to me they didn't look random. They formed a map, an underground bridge someone had built to channel money into their own pockets. I leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the screen. Maya had given me more than a USB. She'd handed me a role I never asked for, the person standing between a small town and an invisible tsunami. And I understood. From that second on, every step I took would decide whether Oakhaven stood firm or was swept away. I took a deep breath and rubbed my face. "All right, Kaylin," I murmured to myself, as if talking to an old friend. "Time to get to work." Then I bent over, reading line by line, number by number, every comma and semicolon. Outside, the night wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth after a light rain. Inside, the desk lamp cast a thin yellow light over the pages I printed, throwing the long shadow of an old man who had built his life on solid foundations. This time, I wasn't building a bridge. I was preparing to tear down something that should never have existed. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to know how far it goes. I truly appreciate it. Thank you. I returned to the workshop just as the sun was slipping away. The last light of day slashed across the oak planks like someone had cut a sharp line with a saw. I flipped on the hanging lamp. The yellow bulb flickered once before glowing steadily. That familiar smell, sawdust, machine oil, a few open cans of paint, all mingled into a scent that, with a single inhale, conjured my entire life. I placed the USB on the desk, right next to the hammer I bought back in 1998, the year I finished building my first bridge for a small town in the southern part of the state. "Every man leaves a mark," I used to say, and tonight, my mark rested in that thumb-sized USB. I took a deep breath and plugged it into the desktop computer. The machine roared awake like an old dog startled in the night. The screen blinked a few times, then opened a cascade of folders, spreadsheets, reports, PDFs, stretching endlessly like a road with no end in sight. To an ordinary person, it might have looked like nonsense, numbers leaping around in chaos, meaningless strings of characters. But to me, an old man who had spent over 30 years scrutinizing every column, every contract, every payment slip, it all appeared chillingly familiar. Just like the time I discovered a contractor hiding tens of thousands of dollars in material fees on a bridge upgrade back in 2011. When my boss asked how I noticed, I just shrugged. Because it didn't make sense, and when something doesn't make sense, it usually smells. And what I saw tonight, it smelled all right. A stench of deceit masked by polish and smooth words. A stench of greed dressed up as green energy vision. A pungent odor of what people call progress, built by those who have no shame at all. I opened the folder labeled Supply Chain Ethereum. Excel sheets appeared, numbers dancing across the screen as if mocking me. Supplier names, shipping history, federal transport details. Almost empty or repeating in a fake pattern. I muttered to myself as if talking to an old friend. "Julian, you think I don't see? You think all I know is how to swing a hammer?" I switched to another folder, Investor Relations. The money flowed from fund to fund, from account to account, looping back like a snake swallowing its own tail. One more click. A PDF popped up. The first line hit me like a slap. Projected ROI, 30%. Sustainable growth guaranteed. I let out a dry laugh, rough like sandpaper scraping wood. Nothing in this world is guaranteed, except one thing, a con. I had seen plenty of cons, but never one using my daughter as proof of commitment to the community. I pulled the chair closer, bracing both elbows on the desk. My hands, rough and calloused, veins and cracks highlighted in the yellow glow, had once lifted Alara as she learned to walk, fixed her old bikes to save a few dollars, laid the first bricks of her life. And now, those same hands were tracing the trail of a man to protect everything I had spent my life building. I opened an email, an invitation to a town meeting. Ethereum Dynamics would present their final plan for the so-called Revolutionary Solar Energy Project. I knew exactly what revolutionary meant. It meant the town's money would suddenly vanish. I left the computer, grabbed a stack of blank paper and a worn numbered 2 pencil from the side table, and returned to the desk. I began to draw, not with emotion, but with the cold certainty of an engineer who had inspected hundreds of bridges. A straight line connected Oakhaven Retirement Fund to Ethereum Holdings. A loop curved to Lightus Trust on a remote island. A bend returned directly to Julian's pocket. Arrows marked the flow of money, cycles repeating, a familiar operation the press had once called a spiral that swallows hope. The more I drew, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a scam. It was one of the filthiest chapters in the textbook of investment. A con so sophisticated people would say it can't get any more clever until someone else invents an even craftier one. And at the center was my daughter. My town. The people who had trusted me their whole lives. I set the pencil down, exhaling sharply. For the next 3 weeks, I hardly slept. I ate whatever was left in the fridge, cold sandwiches, a few leftover slices of sausage, black coffee thick as machine oil. I only left the desk when my back hurt too much to sit. I cross-referenced bank transactions. I examined every shipping invoice. I traced every minor number that most would ignore. I printed pages, highlighted lines in red, blue, black. And the deeper I went, the clearer one thing became. Julian had chosen the wrong person to deceive. Not because I was smarter, but because all my life I had learned to spot bodies under the asphalt, as I jokingly say. Hidden things never stay hidden for long. Just look at them from the right angle, and they show themselves. And there was an angle shining straight onto his mask. I knew from the moment I began sketching those first lines, my life had entered a phase most call a revenge story, but not the cinematic, gloating kind. This was silent, methodical, step by step. The type of revenge wielded by an old man who knows exactly where real power lies. I looked at the final sheet, more complete than any bridge blueprint I had ever drawn. This wasn't a bridge design. It was a verdict for a man who thought he was untouchable. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, letting my breath even out. "All right, Kaylin," I whispered to myself. "Now, it's your turn." The Oakhaven town meeting arrived faster than I expected. It was a Thursday afternoon, near 6 o'clock, the sun spilling that last golden light, the kind that makes dust in the air drift slower than usual. I pushed open the town hall doors, and the first sound I heard was the tap-tap of familiar country shoes on the wooden floor. Everyone was dressed smarter than usual, like they were attending a grand ceremony, not just a community meeting. I arrived nearly half an hour early. Partly from the habit of an old engineer, I like to observe the structure of a room before it becomes a stage, partly to take a deep breath, as if I were about to enter a battle where a single misstep was not allowed. Inside the meeting room, the smell of hastily brewed coffee mingled with cheap perfume and the faint, familiar odor of an aging air conditioner. On the walls hung black and white photos of past mayors, arms crossed, faces stern, silently observing us from a time long gone. My friends were scattered throughout the room, retired teachers, a few sanitation workers, and people who had once driven long-haul trucks alongside me back in the 90s. Their faces were full of hope, as if tonight they'd hear about a path to a better future. Some whispered about steady interest rates, new revenue sources, and one old man joked that if the project succeeded, he'd retire 2 years early just to buy an old RV and tour the country. Then Julian stepped onto the stage. The white LED lights fell on him like they were calculated, rehearsed. His suit fit every seam perfectly, his smile gleamed, his voice smooth. He spoke of a sustainable future, global innovation, positive community impact. Each sentence timed to perfection, practiced in front of mirrors for hours to appear effortlessly natural. Alara sat in the front row, wearing the dark blue dress she'd bought online, on sale for $79. I remember when she showed it to me and asked, "Do I look good, Dad?" I said, "If you feel strong in it, then it's beautiful." Now watching her sit upright, hands on her lap, eyes shining with pride, my chest felt squeezed. Part of me wanted her to be happy. The other part feared that happiness was built on unstable ground. Julian suddenly pointed at me as if granting me a grand honor, and with the support of my future father-in-law, Kalen Vance, the man who laid the foundations of this town, we will build the future together. The room erupted in applause. Everyone looked down at me, nodding, smiling, as if I were the living proof of their dreams. Only I understood. He had just placed me at the exact center of his performance, the stage where his mask would be torn away. I spotted Maya at the edge of the stage, half hidden behind the faded red velvet curtain. She caught my gaze. That slight nod, barely a flicker, said it all. Everything was ready. No words needed. I looked down at the thin folder in my hand, only a few sheets, but it felt like holding a rock heavy enough to shatter the kingdom of deceit he had built. I whispered to myself, "Kalen, are you ready? Once you stand, there's no turning back." But then I scanned the room. I saw entire lifetimes, silver hair weathered by countless winters, hands calloused from labor, people contributing every penny to a retirement fund with the hope of security in old age. And I knew tonight was not just about my family. Julian lowered his voice, concluding his presentation. "We are here because we believe in the future we can build together." The applause rose again, and I stood up. I didn't stand for him. I stood for the people who believe in what's right. I stood to ensure that this betrayal wouldn't become the ending for the town I love. All my life I had built bridges, but tonight I would destroy a single bridge, the bridge of smooth words that lured people straight into a trap. And I knew this clearly. If the truth was spoken at the right moment, it would mark the beginning of sweet revenge for everyone he had underestimated. I took a step down the aisle between the rows of chairs. All eyes followed me. Even Julian noticed. But he didn't understand. No one did. Not until I opened the folder. Inside were the documents, printed meticulously. Financial statements, contracts, bank transfers, and charts showing the flow of funds. Every trail Julian had tried to hide, every scheme disguised as innovation, every dollar siphoned under the guise of community benefit. It all lay bare. I raised my eyes, scanning the room once more. Faces of neighbors, friends, lifelong colleagues, all looking up, waiting, believing. Their trust had been exploited. Their savings had been leveraged as proof of a man's character, a facade of virtue to mask deceit. I cleared my throat, the weight of words pressing down like steel beams. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, voice steady but carrying the gravity of a man who has seen too much. "What you've been told, what you've been sold as truth, is built on lies. Not promises, but betrayal." Murmurs spread. Julian's smooth composure faltered slightly. He glanced at me, confusion flickering. He didn't know I had the evidence, the paper trail, the proof of every falsified report, every manipulated account, every claim of goodwill that had been a lie. I laid the folder open on the podium, charts, emails, spreadsheets, all illuminated under the stark fluorescent lights. Every eye widened, every jaw tensed. The room had gone silent except for the hum of the old air conditioner. "This," I said, pointing to the documents, "is how your money has been moved. Every cent you trusted him with, every promise he made and false, every claim of community benefit, fabricated. The man standing before you as your friend, as a future family member, has built his empire on deceit and the exploitation of trust." Gasps, whispers, faces pale. Some looked down at their hands, realizing their savings had been played with. Others stared at Julian, who opened his mouth but could not speak. I continued, voice rising, unrelenting. "This is not about me. It's about you, your families, your neighbors, about the retirement funds, the livelihoods, the hope that you entrusted to someone who had no intention of honoring it. Today you see the truth, and with truth comes justice." Julian's eyes darted, panic creeping across features once perfectly polished. He realized the performance was over, his mask removed, the stage now under my control. And in that moment, I felt it. Years of watching, learning, calculating, preparing, all leading to this. The revenge was not flamboyant. It was precise, surgical, a measure of justice, a reclamation of what had been stolen. I took a deep breath, scanning the room one last time. Alara's eyes met mine, pride, relief, and trust shimmering in them. I smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of the bridge I'd just built, not with wood or steel, but with truth. Tonight, the town of Oakhaven would stand. Tonight, the betrayal would end. And tonight, justice had its day. The Oakhaven town meeting arrived faster than I expected. It was a Thursday afternoon, near 6 o'clock, the sun spilling that last golden light, the kind that makes dust in the air drift slower than usual. I pushed open the town hall doors, and the first sound I heard was the tap-tap of familiar country shoes on the wooden floor. Everyone was dressed smarter than usual, like they were attending a grand ceremony, not just a community meeting. I arrived nearly half an hour early, partly from the habit of an old engineer. I like to observe the structure of a room before it becomes a stage, partly to take a deep breath as if I were about to enter a battle where a single misstep was not allowed. Inside the meeting room, the smell of hastily brewed coffee mingled with cheap perfume and the faint, familiar odor of an aging air conditioner. On the walls hung black and white photos of past mayors, arms crossed, faces stern, silently observing us from a time long gone. My friends were scattered throughout the room, retired teachers, a few sanitation workers, and people who had once driven long-haul trucks alongside me back in the 90s. Their faces were full of hope, as if tonight they'd hear about a path to a better future. Some whispered about steady interest rates, new revenue sources, and one old man joked that if the project succeeded, he'd retire 2 years early just to buy an old RV and tour the country. Then Julian stepped onto the stage. The white LED lights fell on him like they were calculated, rehearsed. His suit fit every seam perfectly. His smile gleamed, his voice smooth. He spoke of a sustainable future, global innovation, positive community impact. Each sentence timed to perfection, practiced in front of mirrors for hours to appear effortlessly natural. Alara sat in the front row, wearing the dark blue dress she'd bought online, on sale for $79. I remember when she showed it to me and asked, "Do I look good, Dad?" I said, "If you feel strong in it, then it's beautiful." Now, watching her sit upright, hands on her lap, eyes shining with pride, my chest felt squeezed. Part of me wanted her to be happy. The other part feared that happiness was built on unstable ground. Julian suddenly pointed at me as if granting me a grand honor, and with the support of my future father-in-law, Kalen Vance, the man who laid the foundations of this town, we will build the future together. The room erupted in applause. Everyone looked down at me, nodding, smiling, as if I were the living proof of their dreams. Only I understood. He had just placed me at the exact center of his performance, the stage where his mask would be torn away. I spotted Maya at the edge of the stage, half hidden behind the faded red velvet curtain. She caught my gaze. That slight nod, barely a flicker, said it all. Everything was ready, no words needed. I looked down at the thin folder in my hand. Only a few sheets, but it felt like holding a rock heavy enough to shatter the kingdom of deceit he had built. I whispered to myself, "Kalen, are you ready? Once you stand, there's no turning back." But then I scanned the room. I saw entire lifetimes, silver hair weathered by countless winters, hands calloused from labor, people contributing every penny to a retirement fund with the hope of security in old age. And I knew tonight was not just about my family. Julian lowered his voice, concluding his presentation. "We are here because we believe in the future we can build together." The applause rose again. And I stood up. I didn't stand for him. I stood for the people who believe in what's right. I stood to ensure that this betrayal wouldn't become the ending for the town I love. All my life, I had built bridges, but tonight I would destroy a single bridge, the bridge of smooth words that lured people straight into a trap. And I knew this clearly. If the truth was spoken at the right moment, it would mark the beginning of sweet revenge for everyone he had underestimated. I took a step down the aisle between the rows of chairs. All eyes followed me. Even Julian noticed. But he didn't understand. No one did. Not until I opened the folder. Inside were the documents, printed meticulously, financial statements, contracts, bank transfers, and charts showing the flow of funds. Every trail Julian had tried to hide, every scheme disguised as innovation, every dollar siphoned under the guise of community benefit, it all lay bare. I raised my eyes, scanning the room once more. Faces of neighbors, friends, lifelong colleagues, all looking up, waiting, believing. Their trust had been exploited. Their savings had been leveraged as proof of a man's character, a facade of virtue to mask deceit. I cleared my throat, the weight of words pressing down like steel beams. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, voice steady but carrying the gravity of a man who has seen too much. "What you've been told, what you've been sold as truth, is built on lies. Not promises, but betrayal." Murmurs spread. Julian's smooth composure faltered slightly. He glanced at me, confusion flickering. He didn't know I had the evidence, the paper trail, the proof of every falsified report, every manipulated account, every claim of goodwill that had been a lie. I laid the folder open on the podium, charts, emails, spreadsheets, all illuminated under the stark fluorescent lights. Every eye widened, every jaw tensed. The room had gone silent, except for the hum of the old air conditioner. "This," I said, pointing to the documents, "is how your money has been moved. Every cent you trusted him with, every promise he made, false. Every claim of community benefit, fabricated. Yet, the man standing before you as your friend, as a future family member, has built his empire on deceit and the exploitation of trust." Gasps, whispers, faces pale. Some looked down at their hands, realizing their savings had been played with. Others stared at Julian, who opened his mouth but could not speak. I continued, voice rising, unrelenting. "This is not about me. It's about you, your families, your neighbors, about the retirement funds, the livelihoods, the hope that you entrusted to someone who had no intention of honoring it. Today, you see the truth, and with truth comes justice." Julian's eyes darted, panic creeping across features once perfectly polished. He realized the performance was over, his mask removed, the stage now under my control. And in that moment, I felt it. Years of watching, learning, calculating, preparing, all leading to this. The revenge was not flamboyant, it was precise, surgical, a measure of justice, a reclamation of what had been stolen. I took a deep breath, scanning the room one last time. Alara's eyes met mine, pride, relief, and trust shimmering in them. I smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of the bridge I'd just built, not with wood or steel, but with truth. Tonight, the town of Oakhaven would stand. Tonight, the betrayal would end. And tonight, justice had its day. I still remember the moment Julian finished his presentation. The room fell into a strange kind of silence, the kind you only feel in places where people have invested too much trust in something that seemed beautiful. The white overhead lights splashed unevenly across the walls, bouncing off the anxious faces in nearly 30 rows of seats. Everyone waited for the Q&A session, as if Julian's answers alone could decide Oakhaven's future. He smiled broadly, the kind of smile that might charm a stranger, but to me, it looked like a glossy coat covering cracks in a crumbling wall. "Yes," he said, smooth and practiced, like he had rehearsed this exact tone in front of a mirror. "We'll take questions now. Please raise your hand if you have one." I raised my hand. I didn't spring up. I just lifted it, deliberately, confidently. Yet that small motion made the entire room turn toward me. Julian recognized me immediately and flashed that familiar, friendly smile. "Yes, Kalen," he said. Polite enough on the surface, but to me, the way he said my name sounded like he was talking to a retired craftsman with only a few old stories left to boast about. I stood up. The thin stack of documents in my hands made a soft rustle, a sound that, for some reason, rang louder than the microphone in front of him. My voice was low, steady, the same voice I'd used for years questioning contractors about substandard materials. Not loud, but each word felt like placing a steel plate on a workbench. "Julian," I said, "your presentation was impressive. I only have a few technical questions about the supply chain for your company's photovoltaic panels. At that exact moment, I saw a micro-flinch. So quick that if I weren't used to spotting "oh crap" reactions after decades reviewing reports, I might have missed it entirely. He tightened the corners of his eyes. A flicker of irritation passed like the shadow of a bird swooping down and flying away. "This is getting a bit into the weeds, Kalen," he replied, trying to maintain ease. "But that's fine." He probably expected a question about costs or performance metrics. He had no idea I was prepared, and thoroughly so. I opened my folder. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Everyone could hear the pages turning, like flipping a switch, signaling the start of a new family drama about to erupt. "You listed Solace Manufacturing in Nevada as your main supplier," I began. "But company records show it's just a P.O. box, and the sole director is a name that pops up in 3 of your shell companies." The room went utterly silent. Someone instinctively held their breath. I heard the faint clack of a pen dropping. Julian's smile stiffened. Stiff like cheap paint under a scorching sun. "That is proprietary confidential information," he answered. I nodded, as if acknowledging him. "Is that so?" I kept my tone calm and measured, the kind of calm any Southern man knows, not kindness, but a signal that something is seriously wrong. I looked him square in the eye. "Because according to federal shipping data, which as a former Department of Transportation auditor I can access, there has never been a single shipment from Solace Manufacturing into Oregon." A bead of sweat slid down his temple. I saw it clearly. Not from heat. The room was set to state derishov, chilly enough for some older folks to tug their jackets tighter. Suspicion began to fill the air. Dense and unmistakable, like the smell of old paint clinging to the town hall walls since the 80s. "The real question," I continued, "is not about their production capacity. It's whether they even exist at all." Julian froze. He didn't move. I heard someone in the 3rd row swallow hard. "Elara," she turned toward me. Her eyes shifted from confusion to dawning horror. Horror I had already steeled myself to witness. But I could not stop. Not now. I flipped to the next page. "Now, let's talk about your cash flow." He swallowed dryly. I heard it as clearly as creaking old wood compressing and snapping. "You projected a 30% return based on energy output," I said, enunciating every word, "but the money from earlier investors, like the Northwood Community Fund, wasn't used for research or development." I lifted the folder slightly. "It was transferred through an overseas account and paid back to the first investors." Someone in the back whispered, "Like a Ponzi?" I paused for a heartbeat. Just a heartbeat. But long enough for the whole room to feel the weight pressing down. "That is not a business model, Julian." I looked at my friends, my neighbors, the people I had shared a lifetime with. Then I looked straight at him. "It has another name." The room's breath seemed to freeze. "It's called a Ponzi scheme." The words dropped like a steel beam on concrete. No one spoke. No one moved. I heard the faint whistle of wind through the door cracks, normally unnoticed, but now it sounded like a warning to all of us. Julian stood frozen. He knew. And worse, he knew I knew that he knew. This silence wasn't calm before the storm. It was the storm itself. I saw something collapse in Alara's eyes, like a tin roof torn off in a summer gale. She didn't fully understand yet, but her heart had already felt the first strike of betrayal. As for me, I stood there steady, controlling every breath. Because I knew, the moment the mask cracks is only the beginning of a revenge story he never saw coming. Julian's calm facade shattered the instant I finished my sentence. Not slowly. Not gently. But like a pane of glass hit by a stone, bursting into hundreds of shards before everyone's eyes. He snapped, his voice stripped of that usual polished charm. Absurd. He's just an old man who doesn't understand modern finance. His voice echoed across the wide hall, bouncing off the old wooden ceiling of the town hall that had stood here for over 40 years. A few steps away, I saw Mrs. Miller, the grocer who sold $2 pies, clutch her chest in shock. The people of Oak Haven weren't used to shouting in a town meeting, least of all from a man once hailed as a rising star of the community. I didn't frown. I didn't answer with anger. I simply exhaled, slowly, the same way I do when testing the strength of a bridge after a storm. I agree, I said, my voice so calm that a few people turned to make sure I was still all right. I don't understand modern finance. I paused. I wanted every person in that room to hear the next line completely. But I understand fraud, and I understand foundations. I spoke those words like someone setting the final steel beam into place, firm, unshakable. I opened the file. The fluorescent light caught the surface of the paper, making it glow. I chose one document, plain, simple, a money flow chart I had redrawn from hundreds of pages of data Maya had provided. The arrows were straight, precise, like the cuts of a seasoned carpenter, yet within them lay enough truth to drown an entire life. I placed it on the projector. When the image appeared on the wall, the air seemed to vanish from the room. The flow of money, from investors, from ordinary people who believed in a green future, from pension funds, community trusts, from towns hundreds of miles away, all of it, every line, every number, flowed straight into Julian's pocket. No research. No production. Only deceit, dressed under stage lights and a few elegant words. A chair screeched from the corner. Mr. Grady, the old mechanic who lived next door, stood up without his cane. His face was flushed red, not with shame, but with fury. At that very moment, the back door opened. Two plainclothes officers stepped in. One man, one woman, both wearing small badges clipped to their belts. They were from the state financial unit, the ones I had quietly called almost 3 weeks ago, after noticing too many dark patches in Julian's records. No one in the room recognized them right away. Except Julian. I saw the twitch in his eye as they approached the stage. "Julian Croft?" the female officer said firmly. "Well, what is this?" he stammered. "You are under arrest for major financial fraud, deception of multiple investment funds, and causing damage to this community. You have the right to remain silent." He turned toward me, no longer the confident man once featured on a tech magazine cover in 2022. What was left was pure panic, the raw, naked kind he'd hidden for years. You did this?" His voice rasped, strangled with disbelief. I didn't move. I simply looked at him, the look of a man who'd endured too much and finally stood up to protect what he loved in the only way a small town ever taught him to. "Not just me," I said. "The truth did this." The click of the handcuffs echoed. Soft, yet in that moment, it sounded like metal striking stone, the sound marking the instant a manipulator lost all control. Julian's face, once the picture of confidence, now twisted with terror, rage, and the realization that there was no way out. I saw the sparks in his eyes as they turned him around. "You old relic!" he spat, his voice cracking with bitterness. I inhaled lightly, watching as they led him off the stage, the same stage where he once stood, selling dreams wrapped in fancy promises. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. What I felt was a slow, sinking sorrow. Like watching a concrete pillar rot from the inside, knowing it would collapse someday, just not knowing when. Some structures are built on lies, and all of them, sooner or later, crumble under their own weight. I looked around the room, at neighbors, friends, the ones who had believed in a bright future. Some cried. Some burned with anger. Some were too stunned to speak. And me, I simply stood still. Not proud. Not victorious. Just here. Because this was the end. The end of him. And the beginning of a sweet revenge. I never sought, but life led me to, right when it was time to stand up. The aftermath crashed into our lives like the first storm of the season, the kind you hear rumbling from miles away, but are never truly prepared for. The next morning, when I stepped onto the porch to pick up the newspaper, the same subscription I'd kept since 1994, I saw two news vans parked on the narrow dirt road in front of my house. Cameras, cables, microphones stamped with logos from every channel. They turned our quiet little street into something that looked like a chaotic crime scene. The local station ran the story all morning. Julian's name was everywhere, on the front page of the community paper, on the town forum, even in the Facebook group, where folks usually traded small-town chatter about $5 pies or lost dogs. But all that noise outside was nothing compared to the storm roaring inside my own home. Alara didn't say a single word to me. Not for an hour. Not for an evening. But for 7 long days. 7 days so heavy that every tick of the old kitchen clock, the one her mother bought at a thrift store for $12, hit my chest like the swing of a hammer. She locked her door. Didn't go out. Didn't eat with me. Didn't look at me. I could hear her pacing inside her room. Slow, weary steps. Then silence. I knew she was sitting among the fragments of everything she'd built for the past 6 months. Sample wedding cards, idea journals, guest lists written in pale blue ink. All of it now scattered like the shattered pieces of a future she once believed was certain. On the 7th night, just past 9, her door opened. A small creak, yet it jolted me upright like an electric shock. Alara stepped out. Her eyes were swollen, raw from a cry that must have lasted hours. Her hair hung loose, her oversized sweater slipping from one shoulder, her hands clasped tightly, the same way she used to hold them when she was little, begging me not to be angry after breaking a glass. But this time, it wasn't a child's mistake. It was an adult's pain. She looked at me, eyes heavy with something far beyond her years, heartbreak, confusion, and the hollow space that words could never fill. "You humiliated me, Dad," she said, her voice small but sharp as a blade. My heart clenched. Not because she blamed me, but because I could hear the hurt behind every syllable. "You destroyed him, in front of everyone, in front of me. I didn't wave my hands or raise my voice. I didn't try to stuff explanations into the silence like so many parents do in these family dramas. I just stood there, close enough for her to feel I was present, but far enough so she wouldn't feel cornered. Alara, I said softly, I didn't do it to hurt you." Her fingers tightened, her lip trembled. The light caught the tears forming at the corner of her eyes. "I did it, to protect you, and to protect this town." I could hear her breathing, shaky, trembling. But she shook her head hard, her hair falling across her face. "You don't understand, I loved him." I nodded. I understood more than she thought. "I know, I saw it, long before you ever said it." She looked at me, eyes full of anger, pain, regret, and beneath it all, a silent question. Why did it have to end this way? I sighed, reminded myself this wasn't the time to teach, or to justify, or to defend. It was only the time to be a father. "Alara," I whispered, "healing doesn't happen overnight. It's like letting concrete set. If you rush it, it cracks. If you try to bear it alone, it breaks." She sat down on the wooden chair in the living room, the one I built with my own hands back in 2008, when her mother was still alive. Her hands were trembling. I poured her a glass of water, setting it gently on the table, the quiet gesture people here make when they don't know how to speak in the face of someone's pain. She didn't thank me. I didn't expect her to. Sometimes, the only thing you can do is sit beside the one you love, to let them know they're not alone. After a while, she finally spoke, her voice cracking. "Dad, did you ever think maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked? Maybe he was just misunderstood?" I looked her straight in the eyes. No evasion, no comfort built on lies. "Alara," I said quietly, "if there were any path, any single path, to help you through this without pain, I would have taken it already." She began to cry again, this time deeper. "Then what do I do now?" she sobbed. "Let yourself hurt," I said. Hurt, but don't collapse. And when you stand up again, you'll be stronger than before. I didn't mention the fraudster. Didn't bring up the documents, the finances, the law, or the 3 weeks I'd spent uncovering the truth. I didn't want to pull her back into the wreckage. All I wanted was to see my daughter make it through it. She stayed silent for a long time, then finally whispered, "I hate this feeling, Dad." "I know," I said, "but you won't have to live with it forever." It took me a long time to realize that this moment, right here, was when the seed of a larger revenge story quietly began to grow. Not the kind soaked in bitterness or cruelty, but the kind that blooms from resilience, the rebirth of a girl who once believed in the wrong thing and then learned to see her own worth. Healing is like concrete. It can't be rushed. It can't be forced. It just has to be given time, and someone to stand beside you while it sets. I didn't push. I didn't knock on her door every night. I didn't demand that she sit down and talk it out. Instead, I did one small thing, steady, simple, like clockwork. Every morning, around 7, I made 2 cups of coffee, one black for me, one with milk for her, just the way she liked it back in her college days, a little brown sugar, less ice, so it wouldn't upset her stomach. I'd place her cup on the wooden table out on the porch, the same spot where she used to sit, and look down the narrow road leading to town. Then I'd take my seat across from her, hands wrapped around my own cup of hot coffee, leaving the space between us to grow at its own pace. On those first mornings, there was only the sound of the wind through the birch trees and the distant hum of trucks rolling down the highway. She would come out, see the cup, hesitate, then sit. No words, just a few sips, before quietly walking back inside. I didn't say anything either. Sometimes silence isn't avoidance, it's permission to breathe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, that silence began to change its color. One morning, she spoke, a single short question, her eyes fixed somewhere far away. "Do you think the press will ever calm down, Dad?" I answered evenly, "It'll fade, news comes and goes. People have bills, gas prices, life to deal with. No one stays focused on one story forever." Another day, another question. "Did they lose all their money?" "Who do you mean?" I asked. "Our neighbors, the people on that list you showed me." I looked at her and saw the weight in her eyes. Not just heartbreak, but guilt. The realization that she had almost become the bridge that would have led the whole town straight into a trap. I stood, went into, and brought out a thick folder I'd printed myself. The cheap ink had smudged in places. The paper was discounted stock from the supermarket up the road. Nothing fancy, just the truth, printed in plain black and white. I set it on the table, gently, as if the truth itself might shatter. "Alara," I said, "if you're ready, I'll take you through it. But if you're not, I'll put it away." She stared at the papers, her eyes flickering like someone standing before a door she knew could never be closed again once opened. Then she pulled her chair closer. "I need to know," she whispered. "Otherwise, I'll never move on." I nodded. We opened the first page, a list of those Julian and his team had targeted. These weren't faceless names, they were real people. The lumber shop owner who'd let me owe a few dollars when I forgot my wallet. The elderly couple who'd sponsored the Little League team for years. A group of retired teachers who'd pooled their savings for what they thought was a green future for our town. I pointed at each name, speaking slowly. "See these, Alara? To them, it was just capital. But to these folks, it was their lives." Her lips trembled. "I didn't know," she murmured. "I thought he really wanted to help this town." "I know," I said quietly. "If you'd known it was calculated deceit, you'd never have introduced him to anyone." Her hand moved across the paper, stopping at one name, a family with 2 little kids she sometimes babysat on Fridays. "Those kids, if their parents lost everything, what happens to them, Dad?" There was no answer to give. We both knew it. We kept turning pages, money flow charts, offshore accounts, partnership contracts that existed only to hide the theft. I didn't use technical words with her. I explained everything in the simplest way possible, where the money came from, where it went, where it disappeared. With each line, her face grew paler. Every arrow on those diagrams sliced deeper into the image of the perfect fiancé she once believed in. Then came the page I'd kept separate, a scanned note Julian had written to one of his partners. Maya had uncovered it in her files. "The old man is the key. Get him on board and the town's money is ours." Alara read it, then read it again. Her eyes froze on the words, "Old man is the key." She lifted her gaze to me, her eyes flicking over the wrinkles, the gray hair, the rough hands shaped by decades of labor. "The old man," she whispered, voice cracking. I shrugged, masking the sharp ache in my chest. Yeah, to him that's all I was. A retired engineer, easy to manipulate, the perfect living proof for his pretty show. She clenched the paper so hard its edges crumpled. "So, from the start, he didn't just fool me," she said slowly, her words falling heavy. "He fooled you. He fooled everyone. He looked at us like a bunch of gullible idiots with money." "That's what made me angry," I said. "Not how smart he was or how much he made, but that he thought of you, me, this town, as nothing but bait." Silence. A long, weighted silence. And then I saw something change in her eyes. Not just pain, something deeper, a sense of betrayal that cut all the way to the root. She set the paper down, leaned back, and looked straight at me. Her expression wasn't filled with accusation anymore. It was like she was studying an old bridge, inspecting each beam, each bolt, realizing it could still hold. "You knew all this," she said, "and you stayed quiet. You gathered proof, called the investigators, and then exposed him in front of everyone." "I did," I replied. "Because if I'd spoken without evidence, you'd have thought I was jealous, old-fashioned, too stuck in the past to understand your world. I needed everything to be clear, solid, airtight. So when the truth came out, no one could twist it." She nodded slowly. Maybe for the first time since it all began, she was seeing the full picture, not the distorted version driven by emotion, but the cold, complete truth. "Do you regret it, Dad?" she asked. "Of course I do," I said without hesitation. "I regret not seeing it sooner. I regret letting you get that close. But I don't regret stopping him when I did." She was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, almost too softly to hear, she said, "Thank you, Dad." Just 2 words. But to me, they were louder than any applause at the town hall. The look in her eyes, that quiet respect, that was my victory. Not exposing a con man. Not the headlines. Not the praise from investigators. But this. The still moment between us, sitting on that porch with cold coffee and the hum of passing cars, both staring at the same truth from different sides, and finally meeting in the middle. We were rebuilding our bridge, piece by piece. Not with concrete or steel, but with honesty, trust, and the courage to face our pain together. And this time I made a promise to myself. This bridge would stand stronger than any structure I'd ever built in my life. Months went by like winter in the Pacific Northwest, easing off. You don't see the exact last cold day, but one morning the air isn't as sharp and the sun feels bigger. Life in Oak Haven did the same. The noise and chaos from those months unraveled like morning mist. Julian Croft finally took a plea deal. The court announced it on a Monday morning at 9:17 a.m. I remember that time because I was stirring a pot of oatmeal in the kitchen. Most of the money that had been siphoned was recovered. Not all of it, but enough for folks in town to breathe. After that, Oak Haven returned to its old rhythm. The plumber still drove his tired truck past my house at 7 each morning. The corner grocery hung its weekend sale chalkboard again. I went back to small habits, sweeping the porch every evening, oiling the squeaky hinge on the storage door, brewing coffee in my old Hamilton Beach machine, bought in 1998. But the one who changed most wasn't the town. It was Alara. She'd walked through a wreck, broken trust, the shame of almost being the bridge to a con, and guilt that sat heavy in her chest. Those things don't vanish overnight, but I watched her stand steadier, slow and sure, like properly poured concrete curing over time. Alara started a small graphic design business. She made logos for a handful of coffee shops around the region, tweaked menus for a diner, and took occasional freelance work from a client in Seattle. Not flashy, not big, but hers. More important, it gave her back a sense of usefulness. One evening, sitting on the porch, she handed me her first business card. Pale green background, her name embossed, a stylized sun mark she'd designed herself. She asked, "Dad, you like it? I made this in 2 nights." I looked at her, those bright eyes, steady voice, none of the tremor from early on. "It's good," I said. "It's yours. That's enough." She smiled. A small, honest thing, like the warm light from the cafe on Main Street during winter evenings. Not showy, but it warmed you through. In that moment, I knew she didn't see me as some old analog man anymore. The way she looked at me, simple, trusting, grateful, felt like the broken glass between us being carefully reset, piece by piece, into something even better. That morning, I got a letter. Real paper, cream stock with a watermark, the scent of fresh ink that pulled memories of my wife's Christmas thank you notes. The envelope came from Portland, the sender, Maya Harper. I opened it slowly. Her handwriting was neat, certain. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. You taught me that one honest person can be a majority." I set the letter down on the porch table, felt the morning breeze, and I smiled. After everything that had collapsed, the fake reputation, the smooth lies, the manipulative plans, the one thing left standing was what I'd spent my life keeping: integrity. In that moment, I realized something about this family drama we'd survived. Victory didn't arrive with a loud headline or a triumphant speech. It arrived quietly, deeper than applause. It was like a kind of revenge story without fists or poison, justice that comes from truth standing firm and conscience shining through. No flashy retribution, just the steady righting of wrongs. And in the end, we found our peace. I'm sitting on this old porch again, the same spot that's been the heart of my home for decades. The oak handrail beneath my palm is smooth enough that if I close my eyes, I can trace every grain by memory. The sun climbs over Miller's Ridge at the very angle I've watched for more than 30 years. But this morning, something inside me feels still in a different way. All my life, I built roads and bridges, laid steel, poured concrete, made sure people could cross safely. I used to think that was my only purpose. A simple, quiet kind of life, one nobody remembers but everybody depends on. Then came the storm, and I learned something I'd missed for 62 years. Some bridges aren't made of metal or stone. They live right here, inside the heart. And it took that deep betrayal, watching an entire town nearly collapse under clever lies, for me to see it. That meaning doesn't always come from what we build for the world, but from what we choose to protect within ourselves. At that town meeting, I didn't shout, didn't slam the table, didn't threaten anyone. I just stood there and told the truth. And that truth alone was strong enough to pull the room, and maybe the town, back into alignment. That was when I realized, not every victory needs swords or noise. Sometimes the closest thing to a sweet revenge is watching the wrong collapse under its own weight. Freedom works that way too. It isn't a loud cheer. It's the moment Alara sat beside me that night. No tears, just resting her head on my shoulder, exhaling like she'd finally dropped a mountain she'd carried too long. And right then, I knew we'd stepped out of the shadows. Now, as the sun rises higher, I think about legacy. Not the bridges out there, but the invisible one between me and my daughter. Once cracked, now rebuilt with truth and respect. If there's one thing I want anyone to remember, it's this. Hold on to integrity, and sooner or later, it'll light your way. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it meant something to you, hit subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who might need it. May peace and strength stay with you and your family.